Let's go ahead and pray. Father, thanks again for love and mercy and grace and all the good things you give us. And I just pray that you bless our time and that this would be useful for anyone who hear it. Help us to honor you, Father, and again have compassion on lost sheep who have bought into so many lies. Help us to love and serve you, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, this is seminar, The Lotus, the Cross, and Spiritual Confusion. Are Jesus and Buddha twin sons of different mothers? And my name is Bill Honsberger with Haven Ministries in Denver, Colorado, and it's my job as a missionary to talk to people like this, as well as many other different religious groups. And today I want to talk about the phenomena of I have a book here, Thich Nhat Hanh's book, Going Home, Jesus and Buddha as Brothers. Probably his more famous book than this is Living Buddha, Living Christ, which is this whole idea that Jesus and Buddha really taught the same thing. Now, loosely put, that claim's been made by, the Baha'i and many other types of New Age groups, but this is very, very popular, this idea that there's a common theme between the teachings of the Buddha and Jesus himself. And I've actually heard this in many places. My first time I ran into this was on a TV show with Elizabeth Clare Prophet from the Church Universal and Triumphant, and she had this whole idea that each of us possess an inner Buddha and an inner Christ, and that those were compatible and had different functions. And she's a New Age flake. That was hard to take it seriously. Then a few years later, I listened to David Steindl-Rast, who was the head of the Benedictine Order, one of the oldest Catholic monastic orders, where he talked about the fact that his order was getting together, had been for quite a long time, with the Theravada Buddhist monks, who are atheists by definition, and they were meditating, realizing that we are all brothers and we're all basically accessing the same information. We're all getting to the same place through this practice. And there was one of my own seminary professors who started meditating with the Benedictines, and some of my philosophy professors who claimed to be Christian have been meditating with the Benedictines and with the Theravadas down in New Mexico in different retreat centers, and this phenomena of Buddhist spirituality. But then I started looking into it more, so I realized this is not new even there. If you go back just a few more generations, you'll read about Thomas Merton and people like that, who, while they claimed to be claimed to be Catholic monks, they were in fact deeply committed to Zen, that they wrote this way all the time. And they're being popularized by Richard Foster and others, Tony Campolo and others, who see in them this grand synthesis of the two schools of thought between contemplative, especially as seen as the contemplative prayer movement now, that Buddhism has so much to teach us. Excuse me. So what I wanted to put here in my introduction, East meets West, East absorbs West, West disappears. It's kind of a play off the term of, there's an old illustration about Hinduism, that Hinduism is the embrace that smothers. In other words, you hook up with it, it eats you, and then there's no longer you. They're just Hinduism. Buddhism, as a split off of Hinduism, has that same phenomena. As we'll go through when we read Thich Nhat Hanh and some of the other writers. There's an outline right there, guys. So, in a very real sense, Americans know very little about Christianity, I would argue, true Christianity. They don't know the Bible. They don't know what Jesus actually said. And they know much, much less than what the Buddhist actually said. And I have here Buddhist camos, and by that I meant kind of a take on the fashion sense. Buddhism is very much a chameleon phenomena. It changes with every culture it goes to. Buddhism in Japan, for example, Zen is the same thing as Chan in China, yet they're very different in many ways, because one reflects the Chinese cultural mindset, one reflects the Japanese mindset. And so even though it's the exact same religious belief, it's practiced very differently in some very important ways. But wherever you go, when Buddhism hits Tibet, in what's often called Vajrayana, the diamond, we'll go into that more, the diamond vehicle, Buddhism adopts many of Tibet's particular cultural aspects. And Tibet may be the most spiritistic culture in the entire world, in the history of the world. And so by the time Buddhism shows up there and morphs with the culture there, then it comes out much more spiritistic, say, than it had been in Taoist culture in China, which was not near as much emphasis on the spirits and more on the one. Anyway, so it's very much different everywhere it goes. When it comes to America, it changes again. when it really starts here in the 40s and 50s, particularly in the 50s, it's coming to a culture that's leave it to beaver. It's coming to a culture that is Judeo-Christian and has certain things that the culture values. The culture values social action. The culture values science. All these kind of things we're seeing in the normal understanding of Christianity. So Buddhism takes on a new mindset. If you ask the average American young person what Buddhism is known for, they'll almost always say it's compassion, which is an amazing thing if you actually know what Buddhism actually historically stood for. And that Buddhism, unlike Christianity, is very open to science. And you hear about maybe Paul Davies or some of the new physicists who argue as Buddhists and how quantum mechanics and stuff supposedly lines up with Buddhism. A very popular movie here that came out 2 years ago, which would apply to both Hindu and Buddhist thought, is What the Bleep Do We Know? It was running in theaters for several years, kind of a little cult classic, and it was all these physicists who are all arguing that quantum mechanics proves what the Buddha said, the oneness of all things, which is the same as what the Hindus say. So it comes over here and it changes. Historically, Buddhism is very ascetic. Buddhism denied the value of gaining material goods. In fact, virtually all of the early Buddhist communities would argue that ownership of things is just the worst possible thing that can happen. Well, that doesn't sell very well in a pretty materialistic culture. So here we hear about prominent Buddhists like Sting or Harrison Ford, who have Jaguars and multi-million-dollar homes and all the rest, as well as women and stuff like this, stuff that the early Buddhists would have looked at and said, oh, what are you doing? You're attaching yourself to the world. But that kind of asceticism doesn't sell well in our culture. So the typical American Buddhist is just as materialistic as anybody else in our culture. Next thing I put here, that it's coming in one sense in the compatibility of Buddhism in our culture, partly is fed by the postmodern petri dish. And by that I mean there's a mixture of all sorts of things going on. And Buddhism inside of the postmodern world really makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to argue, in fact, my dissertation is on this theme, that Nietzsche and most of what would be the important postmodern thinkers, Nietzsche to Heidegger to Derrida, Foucault, and Rorty, and all these guys, almost all these guys were flirting with Buddhism, virtually every one of them. Especially Nietzsche's reading Buddhist stuff by the time he's in the high school. By the time he's almost insane, he's calling his form of thinking a European form of Buddhism. That's his term for nihilism. Schopenhauer, his teacher, was also into the Gita and Buddhism. Heidegger's flirting with Buddhism, Foucault and all the others. So there's already some sympathy in this mindset before it ever got to be popular in the culture. Some of the more important thinkers are already seeing the compatibility of postmodern thought with Buddhism. Traditional Buddhism denies there's a self. Hardcore postmodernists deny that there's an actual self. It's all just in flux. We get into the concept of dependent originality in Buddhism, you see how that argues that we're all in flux as well. So there's some compatibility. So there's a reason why, as the culture becomes more open to Asian thought, postmodernism sells better. And I would say the other way too, as the culture is more acceptable to Asian thought, postmodernism sells. Vice versa. I said that wrong. Part of what's going on here is we see how Buddhism is sold is the flexibility of terms. Postmodernists stress a variety of possible interpretations. So when we read Thich Nhat Hanh in a little while, and you see how he talks about how he can compare Jesus and Buddha and put them together in the same ideological camp, what you're really seeing is this ability to take words and make them mean all sorts of things. It doesn't matter what they actually meant in their Christian context. What really matters is that you can just interpret it. So we interpret Jesus in such a way that he's compatible now with the Buddha saying on X or Y. And that'll be part of my theme here. Also, Buddhism sells well because it sounds very inclusive. I put inclusive posture, and that's not an accidental word. It comes across as inclusive. In fact, if you read Thich Nhat Hanh, his community in France has Catholic monks and Protestant monks and all sorts of people coming from different traditions to live with them. It's kind of like a Buddhist L'Abri. It's kind of the impression you get. But one of the things that sells well is it doesn't pretend it's the only way. At least it doesn't sell itself that way up front. Now, whether that's the actual reality of what Buddhists say, we'll see in a little while. But it has a posture of being inclusive. And in our culture, inclusive is good. Exclusive is seen as bad. And I mentioned the Pomo Fuchi. By that I mean you go up the great line of postmodern thinkers, and they were all sometimes openly flirting and dealing with Buddhists as Buddhists, and others were at least open to it. So this brings us to some very important questions. Are Jesus and Buddha spiritual brothers? Did they really teach the same thing? It's not just Christians that are wrestling with. There's a phenomenon in the New Age called Jew-boos, which are Jews who have, since World War II especially, found in Buddhism a safe place. They can't. The problem of evil as expressed in the Holocaust has been too much in the Jewish community. So for many of them, Buddhism seems a safe out, a way out of the problem of suffering, which we'll see what that means. And then the next important question, and it's kind of what sums up what Thich Nhat Hanh is saying, is Jesus a Bodhisattva? And the Bodhisattva is an important concept in the majority view of Buddhists, the Mahayana view. The Bodhisattva is an enlightened being who, because of enlightenment, has earned his ability to get off the wheel. He doesn't have to come back here anymore. He's done. He doesn't have to reincarnate anymore. He's got the ultimate knowledge. He can leave. But because of his great compassion for the rest of us, unenlightened people, and unenlightened living things is the way they would say it, he has taken a vow to stay here and teach. So in that sense, a Bodhisattva is a type of Buddha himself, an enlightened person who, although he received his enlightenment as a young man at 29, chose to stay here and teach for the next 51 years. That's what the Buddha did. So when I make the Bodhisattva vows, which all Mahayana monks have to do, I choose to remain here until all other living things are enlightened first. That's seen as the epitome of compassion. And did you know that's really what Jesus was doing? Jesus was an enlightened master who knew the true nature of the universe but chose to stay and teach with us anyway. So the open question I want to address then is Jesus a Bodhisattva, an enlightened being who just recognized that and chose to stay anyways? My thesis here for this class is an examination of real Buddhism not only destroys the pervasive myth of Buddha-Jesus connections, but points the way to authentic witness. And I put this in here for as they were talking about in the last hour, for the missional approach types, not just mere dialogue, but actual authentic Christian witness, that we have something to say to our Buddhist friends. I have many Buddhist friends from very, very different Buddhist traditions, and I love them. My interest is to reach them with the gospel, not just to merely talk. We can talk all that, and we do talk, but I want more than that. So let's go through the story of real Buddhism here. The story is given. This is their version of the story. Siddhartha Gautama is a Kshatriya prince. In Indian thought, that's the third highest caste. That's the noble caste. There's at least 4 different competing dates for his birth. This is the most popular, and there's no scholarly way to settle this. One of the sidelines of Buddhist thought is that nothing was written down about the Buddha for about 500 years, till roughly the time of Christ. So in the literature we have, I have Vilmakirti here somewhere. Oh, there he is. This kind of stuff, some of the most early Buddhist literature is still written 500 years after he died. So the kind of classic arguments that are used against Christianity, there was no witnesses, and that was written up 400, 500 years later by Catholic priests who were editing and redacting, that could be much more easily applied to Buddha, because we literally have no stuff. They didn't write it down. And only when a split came in Buddhism do both camps develop an actual textual tradition. When the split comes between the Theravada and Mahayana tradition, which we'll get into later, but that's when they started writing this stuff down. So, again, about the dates of when he lived, we don't know. This is the common date. He grows up again as a Kshatriya Hindu. He's taught in that culture that there are literally hundreds of millions of times one must travel samsara, which is the wheel of Hinduism and Buddhist thought. If you pick up any Buddhist literature, it's going to have a picture of the wheel on it. And that's samsara. And that, in both the Hindu and Buddhist framework, is the world that we actually experience, but it's not the actual world. As I was mentioning in the Hindu class earlier, in the early Hindu Vedas or scriptures, the Rig is probably the oldest scriptures, the prayers are very materialistic. You give me gold and give me sons and money and stuff and horses or whatever. By the time of the Buddha, which is in the 6th century BC, so about 500 years of development, they're really turning away from that mindset, saying, no, this world is not a good place. To get more stuff in this world is even worse. So Buddhism is born in what scholars call the age of renouncers. We are going to renounce this world, not get more of it. And what happens, particularly the Buddhists and the Jains are the 2 best known renouncers, is that a whole different approach to to their prayers and everything. The term karma changes. Karma had been, prior to the age of the Buddha, the actions of a priest when they did a ritual. That was karma. By the time of the Buddha, it had become all action, not just the action of a priest. So by the time you see the Buddhists writing about karma, it's any action. And that's really hard for Americans to get into, because Americans, again, we have this conception of good and evil and compassion and hatred, and we just have this bipolar way of looking at things. And the Buddha is totally against that mindset. And so I have a lot of literature from Theravada and other sources where the idea is not to do bad, but not to do good. The best idea is to do nothing, because karma is just action. Any karma brings you back on the wheel. So the goal is to get off the wheel, then you don't want to do anything. That's very classic Hindu and Buddhist in some ways. So what happens is that in this mindset, the Hindu gurus have been teaching that perhaps up to 800 million times you had to come around the wheel. That's not seen as a good thing. The world is punishment. And this is going to lead to the Noble Truths in just a second here. But you get this big idea of the world as a bad place to be. Now, in the story that the Buddhists tell, the Buddha, when he's 12 years old, leaves his palatial mansions and goes out to see things, see the world. And he runs into 4 types of suffering, which I list here. He runs into an old person. This is what's called the suffering of decay. Somebody who used to be young and vital and now is old, like me. He runs into a sick person, which he allegedly had never seen before. He runs into an ascetic, a beggar by the side of the road who's starving themselves, and he sees a corpse. So these are the 4 great types of suffering that the Buddha ran into. And this, if you just get into Buddhist literature, you'll see a lot of lists. There's the 4 of this, the 52 of that, the 3 of this, the 5 of that. The Buddhists love lists, and there's always a numerical thing going on. So the young Buddha comes back, and he's got questions. I saw all this incredible suffering out there, these 4 big types, and I don't think Hinduism's giving me a good answer. He starts to worry and ponder these thoughts. His parents are worried. They think, well, we'll give him more stuff and bring in some more women and give him some more toys, and this will solve his problems. It's kind of the reversal of the old idea of when the country boy's gone to Paris, how can he ever go back to the country? Well, in this case, he's seen the outside world. He doesn't want to go back to Paris. He gets out on the outside and sees that this world is a mess. Anyhow, the Buddha comes back. He gets married mainly because of familial pressure. He has a child, and this is not answering. He's got all the stuff that his culture has to offer. Again, he's very rich by cultural standards, and yet that's not doing it for him. So at the age of 29, in what Buddhists called the Great Renunciation, so there's the age of renouncers, the Great Renunciation, Buddha leaves his family, leaves his home, goes out to seek enlightenment. He wants a better answer to the problem of suffering. And the story is told, the Buddha starts, interesting enough, even though asceticism was one of the things that he saw as a bad thing, he immediately joins an ascetic community. And this is a community that started starving themselves. And in the Buddhist literature, it's kind of a version of Can You Top This?, where they would brag about how little they could survive on. Well, I can survive on only 4 little kernels of rice. Well, you're nothing. I can survive on only 3 kernels. And so they're starving themselves to death. And the Buddha gets so weak that as one day he's walking by the river, he falls in. He cannot pull himself out at all. He's afraid he's going to drown. He grabs some marsh weeds. He pulls himself up, and he's just totally shot. And he basically falls asleep under what's called the Bodhi tree. That's just this common tree. But there's an actual place in India, or actually in upper, I think it's towards Nepal there, that supposedly this all happened. While he's asleep, he has a vision. And in this vision, the first part of the vision is he sees an evil demon, Mara, who comes after him and tries to convince him to stop. Don't go any closer. Don't go on the direction you're going. You must stop now. And he fights through the vision. And then he has what's called, on your notes here, the parinirvana experience. Parinirvana means 2 things. It means, in essence, it's your last time on the wheel. Now remember, the Hindu mindset is, I got 800 million shots around this thing. And even though I'm now high up the food chain, I'm a human being, I still may have maybe 100 or 200 million times on the wheel to come back into this world again, and that's bad. So to have a parinirvana experience is the idea that I have now arrived. I do not have to come back. This is it, last turn on the wheel. That's good news. That's the gospel in the Buddhist context, or in the Hindu context. Buddhism's just starting. And the other thing that's part of his experience is that Buddha sees all his past lives at the same time. So he has there's Buddhist art that'll show almost like a bazillion little TV screens, and he can see all the different things that the Buddhists went through, that he himself went through, which will be important as we come back to this different way of looking at the story. So he sees all his past lives, and this is his enlightenment message. And so he goes out and preaches what's a very famous sermon called the Deer Park Sermon. And again, there's a park in North India. He goes back to his ascetic friends and tells them of the truths that I'm about to tell you. Immediately, one of his friends claims to also have the Parinirvana experience. He's not going to have to come back on the wheel either. This is exciting news. The other friends start going out. In contrast to Hinduism just saw all the other points of view as just different versions of themselves, because there's so many points of view inside of Hinduism. By contrast to that, Buddhism saw itself immediately as a missionary religion. The Buddha sends out the 5 guys as missionaries to tell the wonderful good news that we have a fast track off the wheel. Historically, the gurus who have been popular have always offered the fast track off the wheel, and the Buddha was certainly one of those. So he gives them this wonderful set of truths here, which I'm about to give you, is the 4 Noble Truths. The first is that all is suffering, which is dukkha. Or sometimes you read double vowels, so they'll say dukkha, depending on which tradition you're into. But dukkha is this idea that no matter what you see in this world or experience in this world, and by the way, you're going to get a very soft version of this when you listen to American Buddhist teachers. But the original stuff was hard. There is nothing in this world that you think will satisfy you that will not cause you suffering. You say, what about my wonderful family, my wife and my kids? Yeah, well, your wife may get old, or she may run away. Or your kids might get diseased and die, or they may rebel against you. Well, what about the beautiful countryside? Well, there could be an earthquake, and the mountains you so revere are destroyed. And no matter what it is you have that you think is worthwhile in this life, it will change. And that will cause you suffering. The word for change, really critical, is anicca. A-N-I-C-C-A. And the idea is that all things are in transition. All things are changing. As you'll see this in Taoism as well. But so as I look at the universe, I think I have stuff that'll last. I think I have something that's permanent that'll bring me happiness and value and joy. But when I really analyze it well, I see all it will actually bring me is suffering, because it changes. It never stays the way it's supposed to be. So the Hindu worldview had convinced itself, even though this world's an illusion, that some parts of it were good, and underneath some things was this permanent self called the Atman, or sort of like the soul, a little bit of God, kind of, is behind the illusion. Buddha's about to deny that. And part of that denying is that there's no permanent thing out there. Anicca, it's all in transition. And the other one is Anata. The Hindus have the Atman, which is their word for soul, but it's really the little bit of God. Anata means there is no soul, there is no self, there is no I. There's no permanent thing out there. The whole world's just in transition. If you watch the movie The Matrix, the guys who made that movie are Buddhist, and they used a computer analogy of a very old Hindu and Buddhist idea that the world's an illusion. But there are a lot of other illusions that people missed in that movie. For example, when they're going inside the computer, in the Matrix, what you see, the visual on the screen, is this zillions of wires and everything going in a zillion different directions. That's actually a very important idea for Buddhists. That's called dependent origination. And what that means, because there is no permanent self, no one thing that goes to traditional Hindu thought had there's an Atman and you have a body which is like clothes, and then you die, and you're just shedding clothes, and your Atman picks up another set of clothes, another body. So there's a permanent self out there, which is, never dies, it's imperishable because it's identified with God. It is God. The Buddha said, no, there's no impermanent thing out there. Everything is dependent on something else. There's no one thing which goes from one existence. There's actually 5 parts of you, and the parts are called, and I'm losing my pen here, skandhas. And the skandhas are just like your will, and sometimes you see them, it'll say aggregates, it's translated in English. Your will, your consciousness, your body, different things. And those come from different places. So as your body, say your human body dissolves, it doesn't, as the Hindu would say, your Atman goes on and picks up another body. Instead, the 5 different parts of you just separate and go flying off in different directions. And the only explanation they have is karma, action. So as you reconstitute as another, let's say a baby is constituted. It may have the will of a human being. It may have the consciousness of a fish. It may have the body of a tree. It has all these different skandhas, parts as parts, which compromise an individual. And then that individual dies and they scatter again. Or a tree dies, or a rock is decomposed, or an insect dies. All of these, everything in life has these skandhas. And they separate and go together, zillions of them. And so when you watch the Matrix movie again, and you see all this confusing wiring, everything going a zillion different directions, that's really art. But it's also theology. They're telling you something deep about the world. That behind the world of perception, what we see, what we think is permanent, you think you exist as a permanent self, you've had this consciousness yourself. That's not really true. All you are is these different things which have been scattered about and have come together for a brief moment in time as you. And you think you exist, you think you're real. There's the trap, for as the Buddha said. You think you're actually a you. And that's why you have suffering, is first of all because you're thinking. Well, the second noble truth plays off all of this and says the cause of suffering, usual translation is thirst. But another way of saying that is attachment. Why do I suffer when my appearance goes to pot? Why do I suffer when my wife runs off and leaves me, or my kids get sick and die, or the village next door is run over, or the mountains are crushed in an earthquake? It's because I cared about these things. I was attached to them. I thirsted for them. I wanted them. I wanted my wife. I wanted my kids. I wanted the village to do well. I wanted the mountains to stay pure and pristine. I wanted all this stuff, so I was caring about it. I was attached to it. And it's that attachment that causes me to suffer, because when my child gets sick and dies, it brings me suffering, because I was so deeply emotionally attached to what I perceived as a real thing, another self, something I valued, my child, my wife, whatever. So that the problem with the suffering is because I'm attached. The cure for that, noble truth number 3, is to cease thirst or cease attachment. Again, lots of different synonyms are used here, but the idea being, if the attachment is the problem, then to be detached is the answer. It's very simple in that respect. If I attach myself to my child who's going to get sick and die, and my child gets sick and die and it brings me suffering, the cure for that is not to be attached, because your child will get sick and die, or run away, or rebel, or eventually something else will happen and you'll get suffering out of it. So the cure then is to be detached, not to be involved in the normal processes of life, or Maya, the illusion. And then the fourth noble truth is called the Eightfold Noble Path. And you go online and find the grocery list of noble truths, and you right thinking, right consciousness, right speech, right actions, right mindset. It's all this kind of stuff. But if I had to summarize it, I have a real simple way of summarizing it. It's all the mental gymnastics you have to pull off to make number 3 happen. How do I quit caring about my appearance? How do I quit caring about my wife, about my child, about my village, my country, the mountains, whatever it is I'm attached to? How do I make this happen? How can I make this number 3 work? Well, it's number 8, the Eightfold Path, number 4, So it's ways of, again, I call them mental gymnastics. Let me give you an illustration from a fairly recent movie in the last 15 years. There was a movie about Vietnam a couple years ago called Hamburger Hill. And the central thesis of the story is this black medic who's kind of the center of the whole story. And his best friend is what the Vietnam guys called short. That means he'd almost served his time and he was ready to go home. He only had a couple more days left. So his outfit, his platoon, was determined to keep him safe so he could go home. And they wouldn't let him go out on any missions or anything. And they just basically kept him around the base and keep him as safe as possible so he can get back home to the States. And on the last day before he's supposed to go home, there's a mortar attack on their base, and this soldier is killed, the one who was about to go home. And the medic goes ballistic. He is screaming at God and at everybody inside. He is just beside himself at what has just happened. They tried so hard to keep this guy safe, and it didn't happen. And so he is screaming and going crazy, and a group of his friends come around him, and they start chanting. And it starts off real low. It just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. And this keeps picking up. It just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. And after a few moments, the medic starts to pick it up. It just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. And pretty soon they're all yelling, it just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. And then the medic's happy again. And I'm watching this, and I want to throw something at the TV screen. I'm going, no, it does matter when your friend gets blown up. I'm sorry. But see, this is an example of what we're talking about. Why is it I can't be detached? Why is it I care when my child gets sick and dies? It's because I care about my child. So what do I have to do when my child is sick? I have to start affirming, that child is not real. That child is not real. That child is not real. I have to affirm this in my mind over and over again because my natural Maya instinct is to go with the world of perception, which is I'm taught isn't real, but everything in me seems to want to act like it's real. So I have to start basically self-medicating, anesthetizing, as it were, my mind to get past the fact that I'm really hurting that my child is sick right now and I'm afraid my child's going to die. So I have to start chanting in my mind. I have to meditate. I have to do whatever I can do so that I quit being attached. That's why I said it's basically just mental gymnastics. I have to make it work that that's not actually suffering. It's just perceived suffering. The world is not real. It's Maya. It's an illusion. So by attaching myself to a particular aspect of Maya, I have brought suffering in my life. My cure then is to be detached from that perception, get my mind right, as it were, even though there is no mind, because that's also part of the illusion. And the way to do that is the path, the Eightfold Noble Path. That's the classic Four Noble Truths as presented by the Buddha. I mentioned these three terms. Now, behind the illusion for the Hindu was Brahman, God. Behind this illusion of the chair is God. God. Table's God. Everything's God. We just perceive it differently. That's the Hindu mindset. Behind the illusion for the Buddha was the void, or shunyata as you have on your notes there, or as it's often translated in English, emptiness, nothing. There's no God. See, for the Buddha to hang on to a permanent self, even a God self, or a little bit of God, the Atman self, is going to bring you more suffering. You think as a Hindu that you're going to go on and you're the little drop that's been separated from the ocean and you're going to rejoin the ocean someday. Yay, that's the Hindu goal. The Buddha said, that's a trap. You're hanging on to this permanent consciousness. And because you're hanging on to this permanent consciousness, you yearn to get through the wheel. You yearn and desire to continue to get off these incarnations as fast as you can. That's also part of the illusion. That's also brought suffering to you. So even clinging to this notion of a permanent self, the Atman, and hoping it someday rejoins with Brahman, even that, to the Buddha, was a bad thing. That's another example of bad thinking that will bring suffering in your life. Okay, so all of this is the predominant thought for the first 400 or 500 years, and it's called Theravada. Sorry about the pen here. Theravada, which, as they call themselves, this is the elders' vehicle. The reason that's important is because the next generation, around the time of Christ, they identify themselves as Mahayana, and they have a nickname for these people. They call them Hinayana. Mahayana means greater vehicle, as opposed to the lesser vehicle, which is going to give you an idea of what real-life Buddhism is all about. They're not all just wonderful little cosmic brothers all celebrating each other's existence. They really hate each other. And I've been in meetings with both at the same time, and they don't have any use for each other. In fact, as I show you some of their writings, you'll see this. The Mahayana of the greater vehicle, we have more. That means several things. There's more of us, so it's simple numbers. Secondly, we have more wisdom and insight, more true Buddhist teaching than does the earlier vehicle. By the time we get to the third term, which is Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle, again, and that's a Mahayana split-off, again, the mindset is we have even more than the rest of the Mahayana guys. We are so much more evolved, as the Buddha has blessed us with so much more information than those earlier vehicles ever had. So there's a constant one-upmanship that goes on. In fact, Buddhism has progressive revelation. You can argue that much worse than word faith, and they're getting new messages from God. There's always new stuff, new text showing up from the Buddha. He's hiding it under rocks. He hides it under goat skins. There's always new material showing up. And he would have given it to those other Buddhists, but they're not as enlightened as us. He gave it to us because we've earned it, because we're so much more enlightened than them. So there's a lot of arrogance built into the mindset. But here's where the Mahayana take this stuff and change the tune a little bit. To join the early Buddhist community, I'm going to go into more detail on this a little bit later, you joined the Sangha, which is the monastic community, and you generally had to abandon your life, which for many Hindus was seen as a good thing, especially for the men. The Hindus had a very strict order. You were a student first, and then you became what's called a householder. You had to run a house, you had to run a family, and all this. And then at the end of that householder stage, say in your late 40s, you could go off and be an ascetic and try to become one with the universe and try to avoid all karma, so that hopefully you won't come back on the next turn of the wheel. For the Buddhist world, all of a sudden here comes a message that says, you don't have to go all the way through that. And the Buddha himself lived it out. When he's 29, in the middle of the householder stage, when he's expected by Hindu culture to stay and take care of his family, he ditches them. And he encourages thousands of other young men to ditch their wives and children, which they did, which immediately causes major social concern. We'll talk about the women issue in just a minute. But for that group, this sold well. My wife and children are going to bring me suffering. I bought that part of the message. So now there's a way out. I can join the monastic movement. I joined the Sangha. So the first 400 or 500 years of Buddhism is marked by men who have abandoned their families and gone in. Well, the Mahayana turn is going to switch that around and say, whoa, wait a second here. Many of the people who got enlightened when they heard the message were in fact not monks when they heard it. None of the 5 guys were actual Buddhists, Theravada monks off meditating in a monastery. They were starving themselves together in a park, and they heard the message. In other words, you don't have to be a monk to get enlightened. Now you have to understand how broad an idea this is. I don't have to leave my job as a fisherman, a farmer, or whatever it is I am. I don't necessarily have to leave my job anymore. So this broadens the door for a whole lot more people to be actual practicing Buddhists, because I don't have to leave everything I am and everything I've done and join a monastic community. Now, in the Mahayana tradition, you still get extra brownie points if you do join the community, but you don't have to anymore, which makes for a huge issue. I don't have to abandon my family. And if you're actually attached to your family, that's seen as a good thing. So that's one of the big wheels, is this is kind of democratically inclined. It spreads out for more people. So that's why just naturally it became the greater vehicle numerically, in that more people had access to the teachings. The next thing they introduce, let's see how much of this I want to put down here. You have different kinds of their Zen, Pure Land, NSA Buddhism, Tibetan, stuff like this, is the Bodhisattva. I mentioned the Bodhisattva. Let's go back into that for a second. Was the Buddha a Buddhist monk when he got enlightened? Not just the 5 that heard the first message, but was the Buddha himself? No. He was just a Kshatriya, living the rich life and everything. He gets the enlightenment message. In other words, I don't have to become a monk. But when he got his parinirvana, his last turn on the wheel experience, and he made the choice to stay and teach, he could have left, but again, out of compassion. So that's why this term of compassion comes up often in Buddhist circles, especially as applied to the West. Now, just to survey the room here, when I say the word compassion, what does that mean to you? Volunteers?
Care, have apathy.
Yeah, what does that look like? How does that flesh out?
Help other people.
Well, give me an example of that.
Feed somebody.
Feed somebody, great. The typical Judeo-Christian response kind of comes out of the Good Samaritan story. Some version of that we would take care of somebody we saw on the road. That's our illustration of compassion. This is how dishonest this is when it comes into this country and it calls itself compassionate. There are many, many different ideas in Buddhism, but compassion for the masses is not part of the mix. You can see just from the Noble Truths alone that it's based on the old Hindu idea, and the Vedas don't have any social compassion built into them either. If the world is an illusion and it's full of suffering, to actually feed someone or they're thirsty, they need a drink, or they're suffering because their brother has died, and I come along and say, there, it's okay, your brother was a good guy and he did all right in life. All of that's bad. In fact, the Buddha was very explicit in Mahayana literature. Again, remember around the 1st century, there's a split and both two different textual traditions develop. In the Mahayana literature, compassion is not taking care, well, it's not a needed tradition, but it's not taking care of people's physical needs. That's only it's making the problem worse. So what is my compassion? My compassion is when I decide to stay here, when I take the Bodhisattva vow that I will, even though I've achieved enlightenment, can get off the wheel, but I will not go to nirvana until every other living being has gone ahead of me. What is my job then? Is to teach you that you are not real either. See, you're in suffering because you think the world's real. You think you're hungry. You think you're poor. You think you're sick. You think your station in life is you've been screwed over by the bosses, that whatever it is, you are stuck in this world thinking it is real. My job, my compassion, is to bring the message of the Noble Truths to you and show you how you are not suffering either. Because ultimately, if you get the real understanding, there really is no suffering. You just thought there was. So my job is to help you understand that you're not actually thirsty, that you're not actually hungry, that there was no brother who died. There's really nothing. It's all just a void. And I have a different way of using that. Did I put it later? Oh, I did. I'll save Upaya for the end. Okay, that's a quick read on Mahayana tradition, stuff like this. Then there's the third turn, Vajrayana, or Tibetan Buddhism. And really what's happening here, like I mentioned before, when Buddhism hits a very spiritistic culture, it just becomes overwhelmingly spiritistic. However, that's not actually a far turn from the story. What happens in the early story of the Buddha? What did I mention that might give credence to this interpretation? What did the Buddha experience when he comes up out of the water? Vision? Yeah, what happened in the vision? The demon came to him. So we have a spirit in the story. So again, Buddhism is often popular with atheists, like Nietzsche, the guy I'm writing my dissertation on, saw it as an atheistic religion. Western atheism doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as Eastern atheism. In virtually all the Buddhist literature, Theravada, the supposed real atheists, and Mahayana, it'll say something like, well, the Buddha and I were sitting down and we were attended by 200,000 bodhisattvas and Buddhas and devas, gods, the Sanskrit word for gods. So there's always divine beings in all the Buddhist literature, particularly in Mahayana literature. So that's already built into the system. So when they tell you it's atheistic and you think Marx and Darwin and Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins, no, it's not the same thing. It is atheistic in the sense that most Buddhists deny that there's one God that comprises everything, or one God who created the universe, either the Hindu view or the Christian view, the Muslim view, whatever you want to say. They don't believe in that, but that doesn't mean there's not spirits in the universe. Buddhism is extremely superstitious in its home base, in virtually all the Buddhist culture. There's spirits running the light bulbs. Spirits make the spark plugs work in the car. And what scholars call folk religion, which is basically spirit version. Folk Islam is spiritistic Islam, heavily spiritistic. Folk Christianity, same thing. Folk Judaism. Folk Buddhism, it's hard to call Buddhism a folk religion, or say folk Buddhism, because it's basically already driven by spirits. There's so much spiritistic influence. And Vajrayana, or Tibetan Buddhism, just takes it to the nth possible degree. Tantra is a huge thing in Tibetan Buddhism. There's many different competing schools. The reason I bring it up here, Tantra's gotten really hot over here. I've heard Sting in interviews. I've seen several other popular Buddhists talk about the joys. Guys, Sting is on Jay Leno several years ago talking about how he had sex for 11, 12 straight hours. And Leno's just going, Leno's freaking out over this whole thing. But it's because Sting was engaged in what's called Tantra. Now, again, think back to the age of the renouncers. The world is a bad thing. There are different types of Hindu renouncers as well. The Hindu renouncers live in crematoriums, smear themselves with ashes, stuff like this, to renounce the world. Smear themselves with cow dung to renounce the world. In Tantra, you engage in what would normally be considered very perverse and disgusting sex. and all sorts of really, really disgusting things that they do. And it's all a way of showing you're not attached to the normal sexual mores and ethical considerations of the world, whether Hindu culture or Buddhist culture or American culture or anybody else. So Tantra is this idea that by engaging in perverse sex, I'm actually gaining spiritual power, especially in Tibetan Buddhism. That is a big idea. And what they do, and there's, like I put here, real and imagined, or meditative, there's 4 different competing Buddhist schools, and even within the schools there's different strains of thought, but even though the Buddha himself, one of the vows of joining the Sangha was you had to be celibate, by the time you get to Tibetan Buddhism several hundred years later, you have some monks who are visualizing sex as part of their normal meditative practice. So there's a male and female, they're visualizing the sexual act, and instead of seeing it as a sex act necessarily, they're saying, well, the male is love and the female is hate. So I'm thinking about sex all day long, I'm meditating on sex, but what I'm really doing is getting rid of these issues in my life, love and hate, or light and darkness, or good and evil, or desire and non-desire, or jealousy and true friendship, or whatever you could. But they're always seen as opposites. So you're kind of seeing the yin-yang Taoist influence in that. There's these polarities. So I visualize the sex act in order to somehow meditate my way past it. Or, in some of the Tibetan traditions, you actually have the monks having sex with the nuns, but their way of addressing this is that it's kind of like, I don't want to say role-playing to make it too simplistic, but in one sense, all right, this time I'm love and you're hate. And we'll have sex, and that will be a meditative act as a way of getting Tantra, or power in the universe, to come back higher off the wheel, or perhaps even get off the wheel itself. So we're starting getting into the area of stuff that's actually not well known, but rather bad. The actual story, syncretism in the best and worst ways I put here. Let me really quickly read you here a couple of quotes from Thich Nhat Hanh, so you kind of get a flavor for how he is bringing this together. Listen to this language here. In Buddhism, we speak of the world of phenomena. You, me, the trees, the birds, squirrels, the creek, the air, the stars are all phenomena. There's a relationship between one phenomenon and another. If we observe things deeply, we'll discover that one thing contains all the other things. If you look deeply into a tree, you will discover a tree is not only a tree, it is also a person. It is a cloud, it is the sunshine, it is the earth, it is the animals and the minerals. The practice of looking deeply reveals to us that one thing is made up of all other things. One thing contains the whole cosmos. So this is monism. It's all one. When we hold a piece of bread tea, if mindfulness is there, if the Holy Spirit is there, we can eat the bread in a way that will allow us to touch the whole cosmos deeply. Now, he's going to exchange the word Holy Spirit for mindfulness. You'll not find the Holy Spirit in any ancient Buddhist literature. You will find mindfulness. What is this? This consciousness of the oneness of all things. That's mindfulness. Okay? I may see all this stuff, but I realize that's just my perception. What Thich Nhat Hanh does in this book is constantly interchange these terms. Mindfulness, Holy Spirit. Mindfulness, Holy Spirit. He uses them back and forth like that all the time. One thing contains everything. With the energy of mindfulness, we can see deeply. With the Holy Spirit, we can see deeply. Mindfulness is the energy of the Buddha. The Holy Spirit is the energy of God. They both have the capacity to make us present, fully alive, deeply understanding, and loving. That is why in our daily life we should live mindfully. We should live with the Holy Spirit so we can live every moment of our daily life. Well, thank you very much. That was an act of compassion, but since I don't exist, that was totally misplaced. All right, here's some more things. When you say that, now remember, he's writing this. In fact, these are all sermons he gives in his monastic community with all the Buddhists and Catholic monks together. When you say that humankind was created by God, you are talking about the relationship between water and wave. God did not create man in the same way a carpenter creates a table. All our Christian friends would agree with that. The way God created the cosmos was quite different. You cannot mix up the two dimensions. You cannot consider God as one of the things that operates in the realm of phenomenology. There are many theologians who are able to see this. Paul Tillich said that God is the ground of being. The ground of being is the numinal aspect of reality. God is not a being in the phenomenal world. He or she is the ground of all being. It would not be difficult for Christians or Buddhists to see this. So what Thich Nhat Hanh has done is found something that he calls a Christian, Paul Tillich, who I would say is definitively not a Christian, and say, well, see, Paul Tillich says this way, and that sounds very close to Buddhism. So see, Christians and Buddhists are all really diverse. You see there's a lot of just equivocation going on here. Tillich perhaps was even though he's lauded as one of the great theologians of the 20th century, he was just as immoral a man as possibly ever lived. When he was at the University of Chicago, Tillich was noted for chasing, he was in his 60s and 70s, and he's chasing all the young fillies all over the campus. It was quite a problem, but he's such a well-known professor, he can't do anything about it, even as the other teachers were complaining and stuff like this. His wife, she just seemed to drift out of the picture. One of my professors in my graduate program was his TA, and knew him quite well. And interesting enough, hates my guts, but that's a whole other story. I just find it fascinating that Thich Nhat Hanh uses Tillich and uses him over and over again as his illustration of how Christians and Buddhists are really saying the same thing. Okay, let me give you a couple more quotes. You may believe that your suffering, I put a lot of questions on this. You may believe your suffering is greater than anyone else's, or that you're the only person who suffers, but that's not true. When you recognize the suffering around you, it would help you to suffer less. Get out of yourself and look. Christmas is an opportunity to do this. Suffering is in me, of course, but it's also in you. Suffering is in the world. There was a person who was born nearly 2,000 years ago. He was aware that suffering was going on in him and in his society, and he did not hide himself from the suffering. Instead, he came out to investigate deeply the nature of suffering. Now, who is he talking about here? The Buddha? Buddha lived 2,500 years ago. He's talking about Jesus. Because he had the courage to speak out, he became the teacher of many generations. The way to best celebrate Christmas may be to practice mindful walking, mindful sitting, and looking deeply into things to discover that suffering is still there in every world, in every one of us and in the world. Just as we recognize suffering, we relieve our hearts of the suffering that has been weighing on us for many days. According to the Buddhist teaching, when you touch suffering deeply, you will understand the nature of suffering, and the way to happiness will reveal itself. So, what do we have here? Jesus was someone who, well, what is Christmas all about? But he went out to investigate the nature of suffering, just like the Buddha did. See, we're all the same. Again, that's what I said in the postmodern context, when it's all interpretation. You can really say whatever you want, and there's so much more to this. You have to get past your mind. Let me read you a quote here. You have to be ready to let go of your notion of God, your understanding of Jesus, your notion of Buddha, your understanding of the Buddha. You know that when climbing a ladder, you have to abandon the lower step in order to come to a higher one. Although you abandon it, you know the lower step has served you, has been useful in the process of your learning and practice. So here's the point. You as a Christian need to continue to evolve. He would also say this about lower levels of Buddhism. In other words, Buddhist versions that are not as good as his. You see them in the value that they're a lower step of the rung, but after a while you evolve above them. And you see a higher path. And the Buddhist conception of that is I'm still clinging to notions that there's something that exists here. I still have a problem with this I thing. I'm going to the store. I talk to my mom. I have a wife. There's this self thing that seems so persistent in the human context, and we have to get rid of it. So great teacher, teach me how to get past this mind. And it keeps thinking I'm a self. And so you have to evolve above that. Well, anyways, tons more equivocation. If you read this is one of the earlier Mahayana texts, and it's one long, gigantic track against Theravada Buddhism, the other school. And so basically it would be the equivalent of like if I took the 12 apostles of Jesus, and I'm setting up a Gnostic 12, okay? And I want to take the great Gnostic teachers, Cerinthus and all these other characters. So what he does in here is he takes the great Buddhist teachers, particularly the five, the first people that became Buddhists, the five ascetics, and sets up some other big names. And the Buddha will sit here in the story and say, well, I'm sitting around with my Buddhist elders, and there was all these gods flying around us, and I said, who will go down and talk to Vilmakirti? Just a layperson. And tell him about the problem of suffering. And then one of the Buddhist greats, one of the Hall of Fame of Buddhists will say, well, I would go, Buddha, but the last time I went down and talked to Vilmakirti, this is what happened. And the whole story is about how he got shamed by a layman. So again, the mindset is, you don't have to be an elder. A mere layman can be enlightened in almost, a heartbeat like that as well. So the antagonism I'm talking about gets set up between these two communities. The earliest Buddhist teaching, the earliest Mahayana teaching, just mocks the Theravada tradition. I spent at the Parliament of World Religions, where I saw David Stanley Ross, I spent a lot of time with a guy named Sukhasiddha, Theravada monk. There was Mahayana monks, Theravada monks, everybody was there. Tibetan monks, the Dalai Lama shows up. And boy, Sukhasiddha, he just had no use for the Mahayana. He didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to talk to them, didn't want to address them. There's just a lot of animosity that you see. You never hear that in the American press. Jesus morphs into a Bodhisattva again. And one of the things, I didn't read it because we're running out of time, but Thich Nhat Hanh constantly just gets rid of the distinction between God being a person and a non-person. And that's where he appeals to the Palatilic again. God is not a person, he's the ground of all being, which is a very Hindu way of saying it. And somebody else that's been really influenced by that is John Hick and other pluralist writers. Hick calls God the real. It's not personal. And so you can say, all right, I got a Christian community and a Buddhist community, and they're sitting together in the room, and the Christians are saying, God is personal, God loves me. And the Buddha says, there is no God, there's no personal existence out there. There's this one, but we don't know exactly what it is. It's beyond consciousness, beyond all this stuff. And that's, to Thich Nhat Hanh, not important. Doesn't matter. We have to get past all that kind of distinction. So again, you can play the game, but it's not really an honest discussion. Let me get in here into old school Buddhism, the kind of stuff that you might actually experience in a Buddhist culture. Again, not what's told to the Americans. The Buddha's attitude towards women. My professor, Ginny Ishimatsu at Denver University, is a feminist scholar. She's got her PhD in Hinduism, and she's also a practicing Pure Land Buddhist. But what I really appreciated about her was her honesty. And I just cracked up as I'm sitting there at DU. I was the TA for the class, and here she is basically to a group of feminist undergrad women. Most of the class were girls. How honest she was about what the early stories about the Buddha were all about. For example, when the Buddha abandoned his wife and child, there's actually entire Buddhist stories talking about how the Buddha practiced for that in his earlier lives. Now, one of the funny things about the earlier lives, you guys remember what the doctrine of Anata was? What's Anata? No self, no permanent self that goes from one existence to the other. Yet the Buddha had a picture of all his past lives. Well, you might ask, Buddhist cults derived in the 3rd and 2nd century based on the idea that there was a permanent self based on the Buddha's own words. But they're considered cults. Anyways, the Buddha, in his next previous life to this one, the Buddha was walking along the road with his wife and children. Some guy comes up and says, I want your kids. The Buddha says, oh, sure, go ahead. Somebody else comes along a little bit away and says, I want your wife. The Buddha says, oh, go ahead. What most of us would see as absolutely criminal behavior, the Buddhists go, see, he was already practicing renouncing. He was already ceasing to be attached. So even before he came here and did it, he was already on that path. They see this as a good thing. Well, in Asian thought, traditionally women are always on the lower end of the food chain. On the caste system of India, you have to go from a female to a male in every single step of the caste. You see that in the Gnostic thought as well. In fact, the exact same phenomenon as in Gnosticism, that you have to become a male before you can achieve the kingdom of heaven type stuff. But what happens when you encourage a bunch of men to leave their wives and children is you have a tremendous social problem. So even though Buddhism claims to be about compassion, it wasn't. And again, one of the famous stories of early Buddhism is what happened with women. Since he had now left his wife and child, one day his wife comes with his mother and says, please, 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 will you let us join the Sangha, the monastic community? And the Buddha says no. Now again, Buddhists like lists. So 3 times the Buddha's wife comes to him, and she says no. Buddha says no. Then he brings the mother. 3 times Buddha and the Buddha's ex-wife and his mother come to the Buddha. The Buddha says no. Cannot let women join the community. Why is that really critical? Because it's the community that's getting fed. Rich Buddhist men are joining the community, giving everything they got to the Sangha. That's really good. So then they get one of his closest friends. Will you please approach the Buddha and tell him, please let the women join the Sangha? So 3 times the Buddha's buddy comes to him. On the 9th time he's been approached, the Buddha finally relents. And in these famous words, he goes, but if we let women into the Sangha, it will set the Dharma, which is a way of saying the truth of the universe, back 1,000 years. Can't have these women screwing everything up. But he did. He lets them in. But there's a whole separate list of women. There's a long list of rules for joining the monastic community, how you have to live. You can have an umbrella, but not a pillow. There's just all sorts of, can't work for your money, you have to beg for your food. But there's a reason why you will not find hardly any Buddhist nunneries in the world. They don't hardly exist. There's a handful in the entire world. Well, there's thousands of monasteries. Why? Because it's part of the rules. We watched a film from the BBC that was taken in Cambodia, and I'm going to talk about the monk tax in a second, but basically it's about this 9-year-old boy who joins the monastery, and he's initiated in and all this kind of stuff. When that boy joins, it's kind of like union rules. He is immediately subservient to every single monk who joined before him. It's purely on when you came in. If a 50-year-old man joins the next day, he is subservient to the 9-year-old boy because he came in afterwards. So you get the picture? You can be a Buddhist nun for 50 years, completely committed to Buddhism. I buy the whole thing. I bought the truth. I'm living the path, all this kind of stuff. And you will always be subservient to every single male who joins the very next day. Because women are always subservient to men. How that works out practically is the Buddhist monks are not allowed to work. So you beg for your food. You take your begging bowl, you come out of the monastery in the morning, you go down to the village or to the rich person's house, depending on your situation, and you beg and you get food, water, stuff to drink, food, and maybe money. You have to be back in by 12. Only then are the women allowed out to beg for their food. Now, if you're in a particularly poor village, and most of the Asian world for most of its history was very poor, they'd have nothing left to give you. So the nuns were starving. I mean, in 1993, I'm watching some nuns talk about this, saying how they petitioned the Thai government to establish and support nunneries. The majority of Thailand being Buddhists, and they wanted the government to actually support them because they couldn't get the rank and file Buddhists to support nunneries because the men were basically sparking it all up. So there is a long historic antagonism towards women, which you also saw in Hinduism as well.
Bill?
Yes?
What's the necessity of begging for food rather than planting and growing crops?
Okay, well, especially in early Buddhism, in the Theravada community, you had to be a monk to attain enlightenment. Remember? So Mahayana spreads it out. But the ingrown thing about women is already present in Buddhism, even when it expands out to the larger community. So women can get enlightened, but the mentality is that not really going to support you because you're a woman. It's just really built into the system.
Right, but I'm just asking in general about male or female monks begging for food. Why do you have to beg for your food rather than some monks grow crops and we can eat what we grow?
Yeah, again, part of it's because you had to focus on enlightenment for the early community.
Okay, so
yes.
That's your job. You don't have
but again, the Mahayana expand. I can be enlightened while I'm plowing. And the Zens take this to it's basically in Zen. It happens like this, where you literally get zapped with enlightenment. Whatever you do, you have to do slowly and mindfully. So I focus on the flower. I do my gardening because it can happen in an absolute heartbeat. But to the Theravada mindset, all of these routine things about this world were in fact, like farming or actually working for a living, were getting in the way. This way of being attached to the culture. I'll give you an example. We went to a Buddhist monastery and they were going to teach us meditating. Thich Nhat Hanh talked about mindfully walking, mindfully sitting, all this kind of stuff. It means meditating. So the monk was showing the class. I'm in the back just going crazy. Here's all my fellow graduate students and my graduate professor. And this is literally what he did. Moving, turning. Moving, turning. Moving. Walking. This went on for 2 solid hours. I kid you not. And I'm in the back wishing I had a book, wishing I had anything to keep my mind off this. And at the end, here's all my graduate students said, do you? And my professor said, oh, isn't that incredible? Oh my gosh, that was the most amazing thing. Well, that's sitting or standing meditation, walking meditation. Zazen, if you're ever familiar with martial arts, it's a way of sitting, a very painful way of sitting, where your legs are kicked up underneath you. As a man, it hurts real bad if you're not used to it. For women, it's okay. Your hips are different. But for men, it's painful. You have to get through it. But it's meditating while you sit. You can meditate watching a baseball game. You can meditate doing anything. But the idea basically is to empty your mind, like all Asian thought. So the meditative practices, as they do it, are designed to be emptying. Let's see what else we want to say. Monk tax, next thing here. What is the monk tax? Well, it's not a term Buddhists like to throw out, but it's a very common understanding. Basically, families will sell their little boys to the monastery. Girls we don't want anyways their cost, but if I have too many boys, one of the best ways to get enlightenment in the next life, achievement, is through earning merit. And merit is earned by doing one of two things, or there's actually a lot of things you can do for merit, but some of the chief ideas, if I give a 9-year-old son to the monastery, that's how they get their members, and they'll look, favorably upon me, and perhaps in my next incarnation, maybe I'll come back as a monk or some higher form. So there's the monk tax. So virtually this is how the monastery has been supporting themselves for thousands of years, is you encourage. What is the demerit? If I criticize a monk. So I see some lazy monk, just down in the village goofing off or having a drink or something like that, things the early monks were not supposed to do. And I say, hey, you lazy monk, what are you doing? Oh, boy, I get demerits. I'm going to go back down the scale and come back as a frog or whatever. Spiritism at its heights. Again, I mentioned this before, but the spirits drive the culture. Your fear of spirits drives everything in you. So in this sense, the Buddha becomes a little more, in the worst versions of this, as a type of shaman, bruja, witch doctor, whatever you want to call it. My job is to keep the spirits who are above and spirits from below with messing with your life, and they're driving everything. So many of the Tibetan practices are all about exorcisms and how to get rid of the bad spirits and how to encourage the good spirits to come live with you and all this kind of stuff. Buddhist, I have friends who are missionaries in Taiwan, which is a hardcore Buddhist culture for the most part. And he says, for example, most of the Taiwanese churches build their churches on the T's of intersections. Why? Because you can't get a Buddhist homeowner or store owner to build on the T. Why? Because they believe spirits can't turn corners. So if you build on the T and the spirit's walking down the street, he's just going to walk right in your house and ruin everything for you. So they won't build it. So that property is so devalued that the churches just grab it up in a heartbeat, which does two things. One, it saves them money. Two, it speaks to the larger community that we are not afraid of these spirits. In classic Buddhist villages, you'd have a gate to the village, and outside of the gate, you'd have a wall, which is wider than the gate. Why? Buddhists believe spirits can turn corners. So if a person can come around the corner, we allow him into the gate because he couldn't be a spirit. Spirit can't turn the corner. This idea that Hollywood has about the vampires not casting a reflection, that's an old Buddhist idea. Many Buddhist homes will have a mirror right inside. So they open the door and they're checking out the mirror as they look at you if they don't know you because you might be a spirit.
Where did these spirits come from?
They're just inherent in the place. Buddhists have no interest in creation questions. The typical Buddhist response is, I have no idea and I don't care. And by the way, if you read the Buddhist literature, they're always going on with these discussions. People in China and India are just as smart as people over here or anywhere else. So they go, Buddha, where did all this stuff come from? Well, I could tell you. I could explain it to you, Grasshopper, but it really won't help you get off the wheel. And don't you want off the wheel? I call this the divine punt. Every time the Buddha didn't explain one of the many contradictions, he would always point to the fact that this won't help you off the wheel. Your mind is the enemy, so quit thinking about it. Go meditate on a candle flame for a couple months, and you won't worry about these questions anymore. You've got to empty your brain. So he's always punting the question. He never comes up. They're asking the exact same questions that we would ask. There's these contradictions here. Help me understand. Okay, so money for merit, I mentioned that. Demerits for critique. Again, very similar to medieval Catholicism, kind of like the Asian version of Tetzel. You give money to the Buddhist organizations, you get merits in the next life. You criticize the monks, you get demerits. Buddhism and science, again, one of these myths, very popular over here. As I mentioned, Paul Davies, the whole new physicist group, argues that quantum physics teaches the reality of what the Buddha taught. Well, the fascinating thing is if you take seriously what the Buddha taught, there is no quantum mechanics and there's no quantum scientists to tell us about it. They don't exist. Buddhism, I'm reading Rodney Stark's book on the Victory of Reason, but Buddhism doesn't give birth to any scientific approach at all, any more than Hinduism. That doesn't mean there's little bits of technology that comes out of India and China and places like that, but they never apply it in any systematic way, because if the world's not real, why would you want to waste your time engaging in it, especially if it's a world of suffering that you want to get out of? Why would I dedicate myself to examining the nature of Maya when I know that Maya is the prison that's keeping me here in suffering? So the idea that Buddhism comes over here and is compatible with science as opposed to those nasty old Christians is just, again, one of many uneducated fairy tales about what real Buddhism is. And I would argue real Christianity. Ethical vacuum. This I think is huge. One of my dear friends in my doctoral program is named Linda. Linda is an NSAer, Nichiren Sosoren Buddhism. That's about a 800 or 900-year-old version out of Japan. Very big in Denver and in California. And also about the second biggest political party in Japan right now. So this is kind of spooky. Very militaristic tradition. Part of their sacred vows is to defend their temple militarily, because Nichiren, the original monk, was always insulting the other versions of Buddhists, and they were always after him. Anyways, The hardcore teaching of all Buddhist things is that it's all one. There's only one out there. And I've had this discussion with Linda at several different times. Linda really wants a world of peace, and Linda wants, in NSA terms, they call it value creation society. We want to create beauty and create art and create all this stuff. And in fact, her doctoral dissertation is on art and its place in culture and stuff like this. She's a smart lady. And I asked her, I said, Linda, if you're so concerned about ethics, how can you be a monist? If there's only one, what do terms like love, hate, all these normal ethical concerns, what do they mean? If there's only one, they all wash out. In order for ethical concerns to actually mean something, there has to be at least two. But Buddhists reject all forms of dualism. Any kind of two means distinction. Buddhists are in the middle of melting the distinctions and saying there's only one. So ethics is also just part of Maya, part of the illusion. In fact, I did an ethics, one of our classes in our doctoral class was to learn how to prepare syllabuses, and I did this whole, I used about 5 different syllabuses from around the country on ethics. It's great, what I thought was great, different schools of ethics and stuff like this, and she got very mad at me when I presented to the class because I did not include a whole section on Buddhist ethics. And this is what do you mean by Buddhist ethic? I know they talk that way, but isn't there baseline teaching that there really is no place for that? It's all part of the illusion. There is no mind. There is no I or self to be ethical or unethical towards somebody else. So just by thinking it through, monism negates ethics. There's no point. You can't talk about loving. All is shunyata. All is emptiness. In that whole thing, the traditional Buddhist track is this is why you do nothing. It's empty to go out and serve others. It's empty to feed somebody. It's empty to hurt somebody. It's all empty. It's all the void. There's no actual reality to it. You attach yourself and say, I want to help the poor masses. That's going to bring you nothing but suffering as well. There's no value in it because they don't actually exist. Neither do you. It's thinking that there's a you that wants to go help the masses which messes you up. So, again, it negates all ethical concerns. Third, as I mentioned this one earlier, compassion, a misnomer on its best days, as it's understood in American terms, Judeo-Christian terms. We see it as helping somebody. No, their point is not. Helping them doesn't actually help them. Helping them actually may hurt them. I feed them, I'm hurting them, which, by the way, is in Hinduism as well. And the fourth one I put here is upaya. Virtually all cults and false religions have justified lying. Jim Valentine was mentioning the Muni's heavenly deception earlier in the session I was in. That's my most famous nickname. The Muslims call it taqiyya. In Buddhist terms, it's upaya. And it means skillful means. And what it means is, my job as a teacher is to convince you don't exist. And if I have to lie to do it, that's okay. Because the ultimate goal is so good that you come to the point where you understand you don't exist. So any means possible. And the really good teachers are really good liars. So built into the system is this mindset that it's okay to lie. And they actually tell a very famous story about a father and his children. And they're in a house, and the house is on fire. And so the father doesn't say, hey, the house is on fire, come out, because the children might panic. So when he says, hey kids, I got that really fancy wagon out here that's all painted red and covered with gold stuff and really neat stuff, come out and see it. So the children want to see the wagon, so they come running out, and they're not panicking, they're happy and joyous. Of course, there's no wagon. The point was the house was on fire. This is their own illustration, it's in their text, of how a skillful teacher uses upaya to bring about the desired goal, to teach you your non-existence. Okay, so if I have to lie, that's a good thing as long as my goal is teaching you the truth in their terms.
And who are the enlightened teachers trying to teach that they don't actually exist?
Grasshopper. I could explain all of that to you. But my problem is, if you really want this, it's going to take way too much of your time up, and you need to get your mind off those kinds of questions. I'm dead serious. This is how they respond. I went to a seminar in Lakewood years ago by a Tibetan monk, and the title was The Nature of Mind. He said through the whole thing, the nature of mind is that there is no mind. And my first thought is, well, if there's no mind, and you have no mind, I have no mind, then why are we even communicating or trying to communicate? There's nothing actually here. Isn't this an exercise in Maya? Aren't you only perpetuating the problem by making me think about this question in the first place when I don't actually exist? And I need to go meditate on a candle or something and not think. It's such an aggressive attack on the mind. Again, not being raised a Christian, I thought Christians were all idiots and they were trained not to think. I mean, I really thought that. Christians hate science, they hate thinking and all this kind of stuff. I was so shocked. As a brand new Christian, I'm reading Francis Schaeffer and realizing so many of the great scientists and philosophers in history had been Christians. I was stunned by that. That was never told to me. And then years later, as I'm studying Asian thought, I started saying, oh, here's what I was really talking about. Because in Hindu and Buddhist and Taoist thought, there's such a pervasive attack on the mind. The mind gives you Maya, which is keeping you stuck on the wheel. You've got to get out of your mind. You've got to quit thinking. And so, yeah, like I said, you could bring up those kind of questions. Oh, and they did. And the Buddhist response is always what I just did for you. It won't help you off the wheel. Get over it. Don't ask it again. In fact, ring the bell before you even come back in here. That's what they do if you're in the monastery. Real quickly, are we out of time? We're probably way out of time.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, give me 2 more minutes on this real quickly and I can talk about it afterwards. Open doors for witness. Spiritism equals spirits. Again, one of the ways that the Taiwanese, as I was telling my friend earlier, was telling me was that they show their defiance of the spirits. They go right to where the spirits are worst, this corner, and they build their churches there. We are not afraid of spirits. I have a friend who runs a Bible college in Guam, which is historically Catholic, but if you look at the bottom of it, it's really spiritistic. So you have a allegedly Catholic young man who comes to Christ, comes to the Bible college, becomes a pastor, is pastoring a church in Guam, and he will not go out into the forest because the tree spirits terrify him. So he may call himself even now evangelical, yet he's still driven by fear. And that's a very common phenomenon in different parts of the world. So one of the things that we can do as Christians is to express what John puts so clearly. Greater is he that is us than he that is in the world. We don't live in fear of spirits. I know Christians right now whose lives are terrified by spirits. And whether it's Neil Anderson or some of the Pentecostals have brought the spiritistic mindset right back into the church again. We got people terrified of lights going off in the other room. I have counsel with Christians whose lives are destroyed because of spirits, their fear of them. And we go to psychic fairs and we go to lots of different places as part of my ministry, or our ministry at Haven, and I always point out, my God is in charge outside of that building, and my God is in charge inside of that building. I don't care about spirits, which is exactly the mindset I see in Paul. You see Paul when he goes into Ephesus, there is an actual spirit there, not just a supposed one, and he's there for days before he does anything about it. And even when he does, it's almost like she's annoying him. After several days of ministry, he's like, oh, shut up and get out of here in the name of Jesus, But he's not driven by this fear and this irrational thing about spirits. I think we can point that out to Buddhists, especially as we have Buddhists moving into our neighborhoods now, not just Americanized Buddhists, but we have Cambodians and Hmong and Laotians and lots of different Vietnamese. I've talked to several Hmong and Vietnamese and Cambodian Buddhists, and for them, most of them, Buddha means good luck. I talked to a cab driver in Hawaii who had at least 50 of the little smiling Buddhas all over his cab. I mean, they were everywhere. And I said, what does this mean to you? Good luck. And I said, what about the Four Noble Truths? He goes, what? He had no idea about the classic Orthodox Buddhist teaching. It was spirits, and he wanted life to go better. And so a lot of it, again, it's more folk religion in some cases than actual Orthodox taught. Real compassion. Because the Buddhist worldview is not a true worldview, their compassion is completely skewed, as I was mentioning to you earlier. But what do real Buddhists react to? The same thing as real anybody's. If you show concern, you actually love them, you help them out in different situations, whether it's helping feed them, helping them in a tough situation, their car breaks down, whatever it is, you bring about real relationship. Love actualizes what I was saying. And, that is something real Buddhists can't compete with. They can't offer that because it's so contrary to the nature of their understanding of the world. Personal God versus an impersonal nirvana. Again, this has grabbed Buddhists. I have many discussions within Hindu and Islamic circles about the syncretism of religious experience. People tend to bring things together. Muhammad consciously brought different strains of thought together. If you look at the foundation of the Sikhs, Guru Nanak consciously combined Hinduism with Islam. I mean, very straightforward about it. Pure Land Buddhism shows up in Japan about 8 centuries ago, and all of a sudden, after all the stuff I've told you, here's a bunch of Buddhists talking about grace and about how we can't make it without the grace of the Bodhisattva, and if we do the Bodhisattva, if we chant his name over and over again, he will take us to a pure Western land. What the heck is that? All I can think is somebody ran into a Christian missionary or monk or something, and they put things together like human beings do. Well, in this context, the comparison between personal God who loves and cares for you. And impersonal nirvana is overwhelming. If you look at Mahayana, Theravada Buddhist is, traditionally really atheistic. Mahayana's got gods everywhere. Well, what happens? It's all about the same time that the changes happen in India. I think part of what happens is that Christians introduce this concept of a personal God into a culture that has got this idea of an impersonal force.